Hi, Kevin. How are you doing?
Hi, Will. How are you?
Great. Thanks for taking the time with me today. I'm here with Kevin Vallier. Kevin is a associate professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio, and we're going to talk about Kevin's new paper. Um, well, not new paper. Uh, a version of it was already published by the
Yeah.
Knight Foundation, um, which uh, gave the Niskanen Center a grant on its Trust, Democracy in Media program, or was it Media Democracy and Trust? One of those three words in some order. Uh, and Kevin has written a wonderful paper on social and political trust, concepts, causes, and consequences. And it's a lovely overview paper of the idea of social trust, what it is, what its determinants are, and what its other correlates are, why it's important, why it's something that we ought to care about, and also why some of the conventional wisdom about what causes and sustains social trust are wrong. Uh, I should add, of course, that Kevin is a adjunct fellow at the Niskanen Center, and we're delighted that he is a part of the life of our institution. So the first question that obviously comes to mind, Kevin, is what is social trust and why should we care about it?
Great. So social trust very simply is just trust in society and particularly in trust in other members of your society that you don't know. So political scientists will often distinguish between generalized or social trust and then particularized trust that you have in the people that you know, your friends, your family, and so on. So, the best way to think about what social trust is you leave the house, you get in your car, you drive, and the the trust that you have in people on the road that you don't know who they are, you're not going to interact with them very often, but they're part of your society and you are interacting with them and you do depend on them in certain ways to follow things like traffic. So social trust is trust that people generally will follow certain kinds of, publicly recognized social norms that are important for everybody to be able to achieve their sort of diverse and conflicting ends simultaneously. So that's sort of the basic idea.
So it's like I'm driving down the road. It's one of the things that I always find slightly astonishing. Is what like why don't
Right.
people just run into me all the time?
Right.
Like
Yes.
like how do I know that this person isn't just going to blow through the stop sign?
Right.
And that's kind of the idea
That's right.
that there's a mutual expectation that other people are going to follow the rules.
That's
So
right.
I trust that people are going to stop at the stoplight.
Yep.
Um, that keeps me safe.
Hmm.
I trust that. I think maybe this example in your paper, if I, like I'm at a coffee shop and I'm working on something and I, walk away from my laptop for 5 minutes to go to the bathroom, that nobody's just gonna like pick it up and run off with it.
Right. Right. Oftentimes when social trust is measured, they ask people how likely it is if you lost your wallet, would it be returned to you? So yeah, it's a measure of, I think, a general expectation that people will follow certain sort of central social norms for social life. You can have things specific like trust in the traffic system, but social trust broadly, I think, extends across not just those kinds of institutions, but the norms that govern a lot of our commercial transactions, our political interactions. Behavior in the legal system. You have to be careful to distinguish it from trust in those specific institutions, but it is still trust that most people will follow certain social norms most of the time, particularly the ones that are very important for preserving people's interests.
And so social trust broadly is just this general thing,
That's right. That's why it's
and
called generalized trust
or
sometimes.
generalized trust, and then we can measure more specific things like trust in the political
That's right.
institutions, trust in law enforcement,
That's right.
trust in in the military, all these
Yes,
specific
that's
things.
right. And you can get really specific too. The measures of trust you can ask: Do people? How much do you trust President Trump.
Mm-hmm.
You could say, how much do you trust the Republican Party? How much do you trust democracy? So, I mean, there's a, you might think of social trust and political trust as kind of concentric circles, with, say, trust in the president being something very specific, trust in a particular political party, a little more general, trust in democracy, and then sort of trust in society more broadly. Now, all of those more narrow things that I've described, we call political trust or trust in government. And that's actually distinct from social trust, both in how it's measured and understood. At least the way I read the literature, with social trust, you're not trusting people to pursue common goals. It's just,
Mm-hmm.
You're driving to work, you're trying to get to one place, people are trying to get to another one. I think with political trust, we do trust institutions, or in legal trust with legal institutions, we trust them to do certain specific things or to achieve certain goals. In particular, with political trust, we're expecting people to produce certain kinds of policy outcomes. This is actually a pretty interesting thing. Cross-culturally, people expect their governments to produce economic well-being or prosperity for them. There's an expectation all around the world that governments can sort of, make it rain, if people are still using that phrase. So there are some important differences between these kinds of trust, because social trust isn't necessarily trust that people are going to follow a common goal or pursue a common goal or achieve a common goal. But political trust, I think, can have that element.
Okay, we'll move on to talk about political trust in a minute.
Yeah.
So social trust is just this generalized expectation that other people are going to follow the rules,
Right.
adhere to the norms. So what are some of the good things that you get
Yeah.
from having a higher level of social trust?
Well, the sort of central thing about social trust is it makes interactions easier and seemingly less risky. So a lot of the things that we do together are made easier by social trust. So for instance, it looks like social trust increases economic growth, in part because people in high trust societies exchange more with one another. And I think it makes a certain kind of sense. If you're not worried about people cheating you, you're more likely to exchange with them. And over time, those exchanges sort of pile up, right, to higher growth rates. Sometimes a great deal. I mean, more than a few tenths of a percentage point, which, is huge when you extend it over time.
Yeah, and I
Um,
think just if I can jump in on
yeah,
that, like
yeah,
like people I think underestimate, if you live in a relatively high trust society, you kind of take it for granted. That's kind of the
that's right.
nature of trust, is that
Exactly.
is that you
You don't
take it for
worry.
granted. Yeah,
Yeah,
you don't think about it, and people often don't consider the extent to which just like even any normal transaction relies on a lot of shared assumptions about the trustworthiness of the other person,
that's
right?
right.
Like, so there's always a problem of like, I give you the cash, you give me the burger, right? Like like I just know that you're going to give me the burger if I give you the cash.
Right,
And that if I give you the cash, you're not going to be like, you didn't give me any cash. I'm like, yes, I
right,
did. Give me the burger,
right,
right?
right, right.
But that's effectively what the problem is in
Yeah.
a lot of lower trust societies, and people anticipating that kind of problem.
They don't
Um,
risk. Why
they
would
don't,
I take the chance of losing money?
exactly, they don't risk
Yeah.
it, and that raises the cost of transactions
Right.
generally. You have to go to more work to
That's right.
verify that the person that you want to trade with is the kind of person who's going to pay the bill.
Right.
Like we just had somebody fix our air conditioner,
Uh-huh.
uh, and uh, and he didn't.
They didn't poison you.
Well, he didn't. And this is Iowa, which is one of the highest trust states
Oh, yeah.
in the United States, and people are weird about money,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
and so we didn't ask him what it cost to fix.
Yeah.
He just fixed it. And then we didn't. And then he sent us an invoice. He didn't tell us how much it cost even when he left.
Yeah.
But we trusted that he wasn't going to just like gouge us on the invoice. Like that
Right. Right.
we didn't need to get a quote in
That's right.
advance to lock
That's
him
right.
in. It was a
That's
totally
right.
fair price, and that guy's trusting that we're just going to pay him.
Yep.
Because he's not like he's just like an individual contractor. He's not in an easy position to collect from us, right? And so there's a bunch of junctures at which trust just facilitates the exchange. We
That's
just
right.
called him up. He came into our house. He fixed the
Yep.
thing. We didn't even negotiate prices. And it all works so smoothly because everybody's just going to hold up their end. And so that's really the
Right. That's huge. And I think, if you think about it, all the things that economic growth produces is something that social trust produces at a remove. So, that's one of the reasons I sort of lead with that, because I think we all sort of recognize how important growth is. But here's the really interesting thing about social trust is, and this is actually disputed by trust researchers, but it's something I think about, is that social trust produces more economic equality. Now, most trust researchers have the reverse view of the correlation between social trust and economic equality, which is actually quite strong. They think that essentially what people are doing is tracking how rich and poor people are, and then adjusting their trust levels because they think there's some sort of unfairness or corruption. And I think the best work on this suggests that the direction of causality goes the other way. I think it's hard for people to track things like Gini coefficients.
Right.
A lot of the trust literature shows that people aren't very good at even tracking their own economic performance. So, their trust in government will go up when they think they're getting richer, but not when they actually do.
Right.
So probably actually what's going on, at least, what I've been convinced is going on.
That's an important point. Just like just that people can't respond to things that they don't have any awareness of.
That's right.
Right. Nobody knows what the nation level Gini coefficient is.
That's right.
Right. Like so it can't affect anybody per se. Right. Like that
within reasonable ranges that, particularly when, like in the U.S., you don't have as many social cues for who's that much richer than others. I think the more cues, not that there aren't, but the societies when there are more cues of who's rich and who's poor, say more extreme differences in dress or lots of norms that are plainly hierarchical, then perhaps. But so here's what's probably going on. Societies with more social trust have larger welfare states. Mm-hmm. So they have more redistribution. People mind it less. Think about it. If you trust other people and you think, oh, they're going to get a transfer, you don't worry so much about them wasting it.
Right.
Right. This is one way in which you
don't worry that they're exploiting the system.
That's right. That's right.
Like right now, right. we have more IRS audits of EITC recipients than of very high income individuals, right? And that's generated by a relatively low level of trust.
Yes.
Where people think that people are might lie about how much money they make in order to get a transfer. So if you're less likely to worry about that, the more likely you are to support that kind of transfer.
Exactly. And a lot of people, what's interesting about this is they'll say, oh, look at the Nordic democracies, they're super high trust. And that's just because, they have so much ethnic homogeneity. Mm-hmm. And what it turns out is that may play some role, but it's actually less of something that discourages social trust than you think, ethnic homogeneity. In part, it depends on how ethnic diversity is distributed in a society. Mm-hmm. And I want to come back to that for a moment. We can come back to that in a bit in terms of. But
tell me more about how like the relationship between trust and bigger welfare states.
So what I think is going on there is that when you identify other people in your society as trustworthy, I think there's the sense that redistribution sort of seems less like people are cheating and less like you're being exploited, because the thought is that I know the people that are receiving these transfers, or I know what they're like. They're not so different from me. They're good people. They're upright. They're honest. They're trustworthy, and so on. And so when someone proposes redistribution, they think, okay, I can give, and I think it also gives the people the sense that it's more voluntary. They're more likely to think, oh, okay, when the redistribution happens, this is something I'm fine with, because I don't, I think this is probably going to be used for a good purpose. We don't know entirely the cultural modes of transmission for social trust and welfare state size. But I think the thought is that social democratic parties just do better. Mm-hmm. Or just do better in societies that are high trust. Now, those are also societies with more ethnic homogeneity, and it's true. But the thought is, at least from my own read of things, is that maybe ethnic homogeneity makes high social trust easier to sustain.
Hmm.
But there it does seem to be a more direct connection from um, uh, sorry. There's a
Bless you.
more direct connection from social trust to welfare state size to income equality that what I've seen isn't necessarily mediated by an ethnic level of ethnic diversity or homogeneity.
So what it is like people are already higher trust,
Yeah,
for various reasons. There's
yeah,
some sort of history of sort of mutuality.
yeah.
But in the U.S., the higher trust states tend to be like the agricultural states of the
Yeah.
upper Midwest, and
They're often the states with more immigrants from high trust countries also.
yeah, more immigrants from trust
Yeah,
countries. But the sort of traditional agricultural
yeah,
ethos
yeah,
is it's high volatility.
yeah,
So you need social insurance from your neighbors,
yeah.
right? Like, so if you get a flood, somebody else might have to, you're not going to have as many crops to sell.
Right,
You
right,
might need
right.
help from your community.
Yeah,
Your barn burns down. You're going to need
right.
people to help you, build a new one.
Yep.
And so there tends to be a sort of ethos of mutualism in those kinds of societies.
Yeah,
And
the disentangling cause and effect there is difficult. But
mhm,
one thing we know about a lot of trust relationships is there's feedback loops. So it's plausible that there's both causes and consequences there. People have an ethos of mutuality. They help each other. It's successful, right? The interaction was positive, and so they're more likely to be trusting in the future.
mhm,
And societies can get in high trust equilibria and they can get in low trust equilibria
yeah.
as a result of those feedback loops. So I think you're right to cite that as positive interactions with others increase people's estimate of trustworthiness, and that makes
There's
them
going
more
to be
trustworthy.
some kind of like background historical or cultural
Yeah,
cause for a higher level of
yeah,
trust, and
yeah,
that once you have it, uh, proposals for income redistribution are going
yeah,
to be received more favorably.
yeah.
And so you get those bring down inequality,
That's right.
and that generates a correlation between higher trust
That's
and
right.
lower inequality.
But here's the great thing. Social trust helps us to get two things we're told we can't get at the same time, which is growth and equality.
Right.
So, for instance, what's interesting about this is, a lot of the people who tell you this trade-off, they're not considering what these two things might have the same cause. So, if we can find policy interventions that increase trust, the left and the right will get more of what they want simultaneously. So there's this really interesting way in which they go together. Unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot about what causes social trust, but we'll get to that. Another
Yeah.
thing that it helps to produce, the third thing I would mention is just that more social trust often leads to more political trust. More trust in certain institutions, and I think that makes governments work more effectively. I was just reading a New York Times piece on Singapore's healthcare system.
Hmm.
And one of the reasons it works so fabulously well is that there's a lot of trust in government officials to engage in the relevant policy interventions. So if the government officials say, this just isn't worthwhile, we just shouldn't have this, we shouldn't be paying for this particular procedure. In this country, you would think death panels,
Right. Right.
But in Singapore, citizens are just a lot more likely to think, they know more than I do, and I trust them, and so they're probably making the right call. And that actually makes all kinds of policies easier to implement because, people think the government can be trusted. Now, I know, coming from kind of classical liberal backgrounds, we're like, oh, well, of course you shouldn't, trust the government. But actually, here's another thing that's ironic, at least for a kind of libertarian perspective. Governments where there's lower political trust are often less likely to enact free market reforms. So in our country, if you try to cut taxes or deregulate, people say handouts to the rich. But if the Swedish right proposes cutting taxes or cutting taxes on corporations or lowering tariffs, it's much more likely to be received in the spirit of, okay, maybe I don't agree with this policy, but let's see how it goes. So the problem is that free markets aren't very popular among the folks in various cases. But if there's high political trust like there is in Singapore, people can appeal more to market mechanisms. And the average people say, look, maybe this will work.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a kind of irony. You sow distrust in government and you get fewer free market policies.
Yeah. It's never been clear to me why you would expect distrust in government to just produce more freedom
Yeah.
exactly, right?
Yeah.
Like in a democratic system, um, low trust tends to generate.
Animosity.
Yeah, it tends to I mean, it tends to produce mutual animosity. That's part of what
Yeah.
low trust means. It just like
Yeah.
means that people
Right.
distrust one
Yeah.
another. But when it's filtered through a democratic electoral process,
Yeah.
the candidates who are appealing
Yeah.
to people who both don't trust the government and don't trust the other faction or
Yeah.
other
Right.
elements of society are like demagogic populist types. They're types who are going to be like, okay, the like populist anti-elitism
Yeah.
just is a sort of like low trust in
That's right.
elite institutions.
And there's empirical data on this that suggests that lower trust in government does correlate with populist voting. So if you're in the business, say, of sowing distrust in government, you end up with more Trumps, not more Ron Pauls.
Right,
So
like what you really need, like if you want, if you assume in advance that there's like
yeah,
not, like there's no path to not having a government.
yes, right,
And so all of these, whatever passions that people have, whatever public
yeah,
sentiments they're
yeah,
just going to be reflected in the status quo system in one way or the
yeah,
other. And so the
yeah.
question is always how do these different public sentiments tend to manifest themselves in the kind of system that we have?
That's right.
It's
That's
not
right.
it's not
That's
that they're
right.
going to create a different system. It's
Yeah,
just they're going to interface with the system that we have in a particular way. And
yeah,
if you don't think that the government is competent to
yeah.
do things, that doesn't mean you're not going to have a government that does things. It
Yeah.
means that you're going to
Do
elect
different things.
people who either take pride in their own incompetence,
Yeah.
or are just constantly um, derelict in their. It tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
If you
Yeah.
don't,
That's
if you don't
trust.
think, yeah,
It's these feedback loops, right? You have a less competent government as a result, say, of populist voting, and then people trust the government less. So, what is the net effect of Trump going to be probably on trust in government? Probably going to be lower, I would bet. I mean, luckily, we'll hopefully be getting data on this soon. But low trust produces populist voting. Populist voting may produce less functional government, so people trust less, and so on.
No, I
So,
wouldn't necessarily count on that.
yeah,
Like
I
so
hope not.
here's like on an analogy with trust in the
Yeah,
media.
yeah.
Like trust in the media has gone up
Hmm.
since Trump became president.
I hadn't
It,
seen that data yet.
it's not necessarily for a great reason, right? Like
Yeah, right,
as polarization increases,
right.
people just become reflexively against what the other party is
So they
saying.
trust the anti-institutions
Right.
more.
So negative partisanship
Yeah,
drives Democrats to
yeah,
increase their estimate of the reliability of the
yeah.
media because Trump attacks it all the time.
And not because it's necessarily more reliable. Because I mean, ideally, what you want is trust to be based on trustworthiness,
Right.
right? Not to be based on I like these people.
No, it's completely
So I'll look the
partisan.
other
So
way.
like
Yeah,
trust in media has gone down among Republicans, but
yeah.
it's gone up even more among Democrats. So on
I see.
average,
Yeah,
we've got a
there's a
higher trust, but that's
yeah.
not necessarily a good
No,
position because we're
no.
more polarized in
That's
our
right.
opinions about the media.
That's right.
But you could work out the same way
Yeah.
in terms of trusting government,
Yep.
where if you have like an anti-government faction,
Yeah.
that can lead the pro-government faction to like government even more.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily going to the change in the average isn't going to produce that
Right.
much in terms of results. What you need
Right.
is the whatever the factions are coming closer together so that they can actually cooperate.
Yeah, and I think it's higher political trust can sometimes certainly be bad because you will trust people who aren't trustworthy and then you get burned. But it's also the case that if your political trust is low, there's a way in which you incentivize less trustworthy behavior. In particular, what happens, I think, with politicians, and you've had far more direct experience with this than I have, which is, I think that, at least my view is that when you trust politicians less, they're actually a lot more desperate to respond to whatever their constituents want, rather than being willing to say, okay, people trust me, and so I can listen a little bit more to what the policy people are telling me, and then make a vote on that basis, and I won't be immediately called to the carpet.
Yeah.
So yeah, you might think, look, trust in government just enables a sort of more complex behavior from politicians. This is one reason I think a lot of the social trust literature and the public choice literature need to have more of a conversation. There's a few public choice economists that do amazing work on trust, but there's ways in which higher trust means that the public choice models may be less applicable. And I think it's really important. And I still want to see, more work on that, because, one way to avoid rent seeking, say, would be to try to figure out these trust increasing interventions.
Yeah. I mean, that points out something like it's very similar to what we're talking about when we're talking about in the economic case.
Yes, right.
Like it's impossible to write a complete contract.
That's right.
You can't specify every contingency and every condition, and in fact, like if you try to specify everything, spell out every assumption, like cover every contingency, it raises the cost of doing a deal.
That's right.
But it also like makes people trust each other less. Like they're like, why are these people so anxious to have me specify that I'm going to pay them after I've promised? Like, so like, like you can do more handshake deals when people just like trust each other. And it's similar in government where when we see it with Trump in office, there's a huge number of norms that allow government to function.
That's right.
That nobody's ever maybe articulated or specified. But as long as we can trust that people will adhere to them, we don't need to articulate or specify them.
That's right.
That you're not going to just sue Congress if it tries to exercise its constitutional prerogatives, right? Like, that's not something that anybody thought that would happen. That like, and so like that, and so that decline in trust makes it actually difficult for the government to function.
That's
like,
right.
Not just in a, like libertarians might like, like, oh, I don't want the government to function. Like, because I don't like taxes.
No, it's the class the liberal functions.
Yeah,
the rule of law, limited government, those kinds of norms.
Exactly.
That you want there to be. You want to be able to trust that people will follow those norms. I mean, a lot of the things that you care about with trust is, of course, what you're trusting people to do. And in many cases, what we trust politicians to do is to not violate certain kinds of restrictions. I mean, the difficulty for that thing that worries me the most with Trump is his lack of concern or knowledge of the sort of basic constitutional norms. And so he just violates them a lot, and it sometimes doesn't realize, and other times just doesn't care. And so, now we're trying to articulate and place certain kinds of restraints. We're having all these conversations about how to rein somebody in, rather than having the conversations about, solving other kinds of problems. So low trust can get you caught up in a lot of sort of pointless fighting. So, I mean, one thing that happens, one thing that decreases trust in government are acts of public corruption, which is why I'm wondering how the political trust numbers will go. They may be so polarized when they come out with Trump that it just, like you said with the media, that trust in Trump just goes up and trust by Republicans and trust in Democrats goes down, and then, not much happens to the regular trust level. So ironically, polarization can actually prevent low trust from occurring, which is bad because you want trust levels to be rooted in a judgment that and trustworthiness, and not just, I like this guy, so I'm going to excuse
Yeah.
anything that he does
I
at
don't know
all.
that I've seen any literature that would be interesting.
Yeah,
I like
yeah,
because generally at the social level they are measuring averages,
yeah, yes,
and so I haven't seen much on like trust inequality, like or like trust polarization,
yeah.
specifically on social trust where you
No,
like
not on social. Yeah, social. What's key about social for us is that we're one of the only countries where it's falling. So social trust is a really stable measure
mm-hmm,
in almost all the countries where it's measured. I mean, if you read, so there's this great economist, Andreas Berg, who wrote a history of the Swedish welfare state.
mm-hmm,
And he points out there's kind of these three periods in its development. One where it's more limited, the government isn't spending very much in terms of GDP. This is, in the 50s or so. It takes on these heavy duty, kind of standard style democratic socialist elements.
mm-hmm.
And then it backs off of that, to a capitalist welfare state where it's still consuming a lot of GDP, but it isn't messing with markets very much. But then if you look at the social trust numbers, they're just pretty, there's a little bit of oscillation, but they're
Yeah.
they're pretty stable. But in the U.S., it seems like social trust is falling from, several decades ago, around 50% you can trust most people, and now we're down closer to 30%.
So what's
Um,
the
we don't know.
leading hypothesis for that?
I have a hypothesis that I need help, maybe from someone who's listening, to help me figure out empirically. My hypothesis is that social trust, political trust, and polarization are in a kind of causal feedback loop. Um, that the sense that people have from there being more fighting and more obvious open conflicts over important issues may be leading people to feel like they can't trust each other as much. The difficulty is with the hypothesis is that there's lots of that stuff in higher trust periods of time, but you might think that what happened was that we got a relatively higher level of social trust that just came from having external enemies,
Yes.
like, communism, and that constant social strife just ate that up, and has reduced it some. Whereas in other countries where there's comparatively less disagreement, smaller countries, fewer practical differences like differences in religiosity, they're just not having the same kinds of fights. But I can't verify it yet
Yeah.
because we have the trust data and we have the polarization data, but as far as I can tell, no one's tried to align them together.
Put them together in
So I
that
would be
way.
very interested to know. So that's my hypothesis. Other people, so the left wing kind of view is that, oh well, it's rising inequality and look how well
Right.
they correlate. But we sort of talked about why that may be
Mm-hmm.
worrisome. And so I think it's harder to say. I don't really know what a lot of the conservatives are saying on this, but they tend to follow kind of Putnam stories that, well, we're interacting less because we're less involved in certain kinds of associations, and that may be reducing trust levels because people aren't interacting as much. I mean, I
Too
think
much
that's,
Netflix and chill. Like, well, like,
yeah,
the dominant right leaning
yeah,
view about trust that I hear is that it's immigration. Like that, like we've had
yes,
massive demographic change. So
yeah,
since
yeah,
the mid '60s, when the Johnson passed, uh, you know you know big changes to the
yeah,
immigration system.
yeah,
The it didn't work out exactly the way they were expecting, and it did change
yeah,
the demographic composition of the country in a pretty significant way.
yeah,
Which brings us to one of the topics that you cover briefly in the paper
yeah,
is a lot of people think that there's a strong correlation between
yeah,
homogeneity
yeah,
and higher levels of trust.
yeah,
And at some level, that's fairly intuitive.
yeah,
That
that's right.
it's just easier to trust people who are like you. You
In obvious ways,
yeah.
yeah,
You can read them better.
yeah,
Like if I meet somebody who's from the same hometown as me in Iowa,
yeah,
another like 40 something like a white guy from Central
yeah, yeah,
Iowa, it's like I'm gonna get him.
right,
Right, like
yep,
and so there's going to be some shared assumptions that we can take for granted. But if somebody's from a very, very different
yeah,
cultural milieu, I might not have any reason to
yeah.
distrust them, but I just don't
It's
know what to
uneasy.
expect.
Yeah, I mean, because trust comes in degrees. So, someone you don't know, you might think, well, I'm going to try to be positive in this interaction. But then people it's a little bit easier. So here's what's interesting about ethnic diversity and social trust is that there isn't very much of a negative correlation. A lot of people find there's a small negative correlation. You get more diversity, you get less social trust. Some people find none. And I think, and this is something that that Ryan Muldoon is working on more than I am, is about the distribution, particularly like geographical distribution of certain kinds of differences. So, for instance, here's one situation: is imagine that immigration was completely confined to one state.
Right.
You know, a state that people don't interact with very much. Imagine that Hispanic immigrants all went to Montana. In that case, you know, people might trust less, but they're not interacting with the difference as much. And so it might not hit social trust very much because that may be sustained a lot by people's interactions. Here's another way it could go. You have some kind of broad, urban, desegregated kind of diversity where you interact with the people that are different a lot. And so you develop cross-cutting sort of social identities with them, like being members of the same city or the same clubs or the same church. But here's what's probably bad is local segregation. So if it's like that's the Italian neighborhood and that's the Irish neighborhood and that's the black neighborhood, then it can be potentially really negative. So I think that a lot of the relationship between ethnic diversity and social trust is a matter of how societies structure those structure that diversity. That's why, you know, integration could be very important.
Yeah.
So
Ryan has written a whole paper on this for us.
Yeah.
I will talk to him on this topic at length. But yeah, as far as I can tell from what I learned from your paper and Ryan's especially on that on that subject, is that diversity per se has, you know, and there's a lot of ways to measure diversity.
That's right.
But just you know, a variegated population that's not very uniform. Just that fact doesn't predict.
That's right.
Lower trust. Segregation of those populations does, and that gets complicated quickly. Some of it's just that, you know, when people interact, the contact just breeds familiarity.
Yeah.
And familiarity breeds trust. But some of it is just like the very fact of division. Kind of people seem to sort of kind of ex post justify it by well, there must be a reason we don't want to be next to those people.
Yes.
And there tends to be a sort of self-reinforcing aspect to segregation, where the mere fact that people are segregated makes people suspicious of the people on the other side of the line.
Yeah.
But
more
you know,
feedback.
And one thing that I've talked to Ryan about is that, and again, it's hard to differentiate some of these historical factors from just like diversity per se. So like in a lot of the most diverse societies are colonial societies, right? Like you've got, so like if you know, England, you know, comes into your country and you know, and colonizes it and rules it for several generations, and then you know, that funnels back people from all sorts of countries to the kind of colonial capital.
That's
right? Like, so the reason France is as diverse as it is, and the reason that England is as diverse as it is partly, you know, a function of its colonial history. But that colonial history is a history of one ethnic group brutally oppressing another ethnic group. So when a history of colonization and occupation and oppression is part of the explanation for the diversity, you would expect that diversity to not go along with a high level of trust, because there's a real history of mutual animosity that was instigated by the, you know, majority. You know, and so similarly in the United States, with a history of enslavement, legal apartheid, like there's a lot of, you know, mutual distrust between white and black populations that are driven from the African American side, who don't trust white people very much, because white people have treated them like crap, and so like which again tends to generate segregation from
Yeah.
both sides.
Right.
Like people prefer their own in group when their in group is oppressed by
Right.
another group. There's safety in numbers, right? So things get very complicated very quickly.
Yeah, well, the
But that
idea is
doesn't. But
that's
it,
a case where you have lower trustworthiness leading to lower trust, right? Like
right.
you actually have a judgment that's based in some kind of observation, like, oh, look, the government was experimenting on people with of my race, or they constantly killed, members of my group. So yeah, I mean, even in other countries where there's big government failures of some kind, like collectivization of farming in China, where there's still lower, even today, there's still lower trust in the Chinese government among places where the famines occurred. So a lot of times, yeah, the lower trust will be based in lower trustworthiness, and in that case, it's really hard to correct because the thought is, you can't just say to people, no, 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 you're mistaken. Like, look, these people are actually not what you think. In that case, you think, okay, there's this historical memory, and it's true. And so you're sort of in a difficult situation. So
Yeah, and that and that kind of if you're thinking in a sophisticated way about the question about diversity,
yeah,
it's important to think about like where the diversity comes from,
yeah,
or like the degree to which it corresponds to segregation,
right,
what the causes of that segregation are, and differentiate some of those cases from just like modern day immigrant hub cities. Like most immigrant populations come in through a fairly small set of
yeah,
cities. So like a city like Houston, Texas is a big immigrant hub these
hmm,
days. It's incredibly diverse,
yeah,
many different populations, but its diversity doesn't reflect a history of colonization,
right,
a history of enslavement, blah blah blah. It and there are a lot of Mexicans in Houston,
yeah,
but it doesn't. It's not mostly Mexican even. There are huge
right,
Asian populations, huge African
yeah,
populations, and there's really no history with those populations. They don't
right,
distrust Americans for any particular reason, and there is just a lot of mix in the city.
right,
Things like there is a lot of segregation because people self-segregate. They like to live
yeah,
next to people next to them, but it's just like a jumble and a hodgepodge, and
yeah,
it's super diverse. But there's no reason to believe that that diversity reduces social trust in general, as like
yeah,
you saw when there were like these big floods in Houston a couple years ago, and you had all these touching pictures of these people of very different ethnicities saving each other's in
yeah,
boats,
yeah,
eh,
yeah.
because
That's right.
that diversity just has nothing to do
Yeah.
with people's sense of their shared membership in that political
Yeah,
community.
yeah, and I mean, one thing this can kind of we can transition to some of the causes of social trust because there are some mysteries here. One cause of distrust that we've talked about again is ethnic diversity, but we've seen that's complex. Um, there are some other things worth mentioning at least. So there aren't actually a whole lot of institutional changes that affect social trust levels. But the ones that do seem to matter have to do with basic legal functions,
Mm-hmm.
like are your property titles protected? Tax rates don't matter.
Mm-hmm.
What matters is can people steal from you?
Right.
Can they get away with mugging you? Can you trust the police? Can you trust the courts? Do you see bribes being taken? Observing bribes is bad for social trust, which you might expect. And communism destroys trust, and we don't entirely know why, but like there's still differences in trust levels between East and West Germany even today.
Yeah.
And what I think probably explains most of it is that isn't actually impoverishment, because actually economic growth and wealth levels don't affect trust as much as you would think. It has to do with everybody ratting each other out to the secret police.
Yeah.
So, if you have a police state, that can be really bad for social trust. Um, so,
Yeah.
but
That seems like that ought to be obvious, but like yeah.
yeah. So, but beyond that, there seem to be these really stable, but in some cases quite different levels of social trust in different countries. It's falling in the U.S. There's a few countries where it's going up, but most countries, it's just very, very stable.
Who's
And
like
we
the world champion of trust?
oh, it's all the Nordic countries are super high.
Yeah.
It's one reason they can make almost all their institutions work well simultaneously. But countries that get worse are like Brazil, but then a lot of African countries, particularly when you've had a really destructive conflict in recent memory.
Mm-hmm.
People don't feel even like they're physically safe. That's another big issue.
Right.
In fact, in a lot of trust measures, you have to factor out. Sometimes they factor out whether a person's been mugged or not, because you could just people just think, oh no, someone attacked me or
Yeah,
whatever.
no, it's traumatizing.
Yeah.
Like who's going to hurt me next?
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
So it sounds like the most important things
Yeah.
are things that aren't really very ideological, but are
Right.
often overlooked.
That's
Security
right.
of property rights,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
basic rule of law kind
That's
of
right.
stuff that
Yeah.
you can expect the police and the judiciary to be relatively impartial.
That's right.
They're not going to like pick on a particular class of person.
Yeah.
Like the system, people don't think the system is rigged, right?
Right.
Like a low level of corruption
Yes.
is very important. And I feel like that is one of those things where to me the logic of either, especially like negative reinforcement, is really really clear. If the system starts to seem corrupt, then it starts to seem like following the rules is something that suckers do, and that you're just going to get taken advantage of unless you offer the bribe. And
it is irrational. It's irrational to trust when others aren't trustworthy, right?
Right.
And you have the trust game in game theory, which is just a sequential prisoner's dilemma. If I trust, I'm going to play cooperate in the belief that you'll play cooperate. But of course, if you think the other person's going to defect, then you should defect. So yeah, it becomes something that even very good people can get caught up in.
But then you get trapped in an equilibrium. It's like a little
right.
sink that you can't
right.
like get back out of.
Basin of attraction. Yes, that's right.
Because you don't know. Because if you ever, people. If I develop a rational expectation that you're going to cheat, then it makes sense for me to cheat.
And then they're going to think you're going to cheat, and they're going to be right.
and they're going to be right, and it's hard to get out of it because because nobody has a unilateral incentive to cooperate. And it's hard to communicate you'd be like, I'm a good cooperator. Let's all be good cooperators. Let's all follow the rules.
People should,
once you've kind of like spent down that trust, it's hard to get it back. I mean, it's like it's like if like you're in a marriage and one of the partners cheats on the other partner.
That's right.
Right? Like it's hard to get that trust back, right? Like it takes a lot of work. If you betray, somebody's trust, but it's even harder when it's a collective action problem, right? It's not about just like reconciliation between two people, one of whom has cheated the other. It's about getting millions of people simultaneously to readjust their expectations about what other people will do, and accordingly adjust their intentions about what they're going to do. And that's just like basically an impossible problem, which is why it's so precious. The trust that you have is such a precious resource.
And interestingly, social trust isn't as fragile as people often think. It can take a while to break down. It's just that once it's broken down, it can take a while to build back up. Because trust also has a positive feedback loop, right? High trust, you play cooperate, other people play cooperate. So you can get in these high and low trust equilibria, and it can be difficult to get out of the high trust equilibria to the low, and to get from the low to the high. What's interesting is that we just haven't been measuring it long enough to really know why it is at the levels that it is for different cultures. There's some indication that trust may at least be partly influenced by Big Five personality traits. And depending on how those are distributed, if they're just, it's possible there's a genetic component.
Yeah. So what is it? Higher agreeableness is going to be.
Yeah, I think higher neuroticism is lower trust too.
Right.
Which isn't surprising. So, and I can't remember right off, but the details, the citations to the relevant studies are in the paper. So we don't entirely know. Yeah. And it's one of the reasons I think the research is so important. Now, the interesting thing is that while we we know a lot about the good effects of social trust. We don't know a lot about what causes it. We actually do know more about what causes trust in government.
So tell me about that.
Yeah, so it looks like what people do when they're determining whether they trust the government is they make two judgments, an input judgment and an output judgment. The input judgment is this process fair and non-corrupt and equal? And the output judgment is, are they producing the outcomes that I want, or that I think they ought to be producing? And interestingly enough, in developing countries, the output measure seems to matter a lot more.
Yeah.
So, if you're poor and you're getting richer quickly, then you're willing to overlook a lot of shady government behavior. But if you're in a more developed country where growth is slower, and particularly in societies where people are so wealthy, they become relatively less concerned with economic growth, they start to pay attention to other factors more. And so their trust levels become more attuned to they become more attuned to whether the government is pursuing certain kinds of objectives. So things like people start to care more about racial equality, or other sort of measures of not in the negative sense ideology, but measures of sort of ideological satisfaction. So, but also they start to care a lot about public corruption. So, Watergate was very destructive for trust in government in the U.S. because it was a very salient act of what some call grand corruption. And if you look at the political trust numbers, they recovered a bit, but really the big recovery was after 9/11, and then just like there afterwards. And there's this little blip with the Gulf War, first Gulf War.
Yeah.
But things have been lower there. So it looks like we were in a kind of higher trust equilibrium where economic growth was high. People felt like there was more economic equality, and so there was less sense that things were rigged. A lot of and government was seen, as much less corrupt, and ideological differences were a lot narrower, and so people's lenses for judging corruption weren't so tinted. So there are all these factors that conspire to produce relatively high political trust in the U.S. in the post-war period. And then in the 70s, a whole bunch of differences simultaneously came together that produced lower.
So it's hard to pin it on any one thing, right? Like
that's right. It's
so like you get. I mean, so Watergate's clearly a big thing that would
in the Vietnam War too.
And you get Vietnam as well. But then you also get the end of this era of post-war boom growth.
That's right.
You get like stagflation in the 70s, right? Like, which is like unrelated to Watergate,
right?
And into the 80s, you get the onset of the beginning of the the Great Stagnation, right? It's basically the growth rate starts slowing down in a particular in a more or less permanent way. That corresponds with the end of regional convergence in economic growth, right? So like all the poorer regions had been catching up to richer regions, but then they started pulling apart like in the 80s. And so there's a bunch of things going on that could conceivably have an effect on political trust.
They hit the input and the output measures. So it's more corrupt. It seems more corrupt and less fair, the process, and it's producing fewer desirable outcomes, particularly in terms of people's perceived economic benefit, which it doesn't always track what their actual benefit is. But I think very broadly it does tend to. 10 years go by, you're going to be a reasonable judge about whether you're richer than you were 10 years before. Right. Now, of course, people expect the government to produce more economic growth, and of course, government's ability to do that is more limited than people think. I mean, you might think people sort of still have a kind of divine right of kings model, like God favors the king produces the harvest, and all these kinds of things where they think the government has this kind of power to produce better outcomes that it doesn't have, but it does have an effect, right? So it's not completely absurd.
I would add into the list of things that would harm trust is that there was a period just right prior through the Watergate area of a high level of bipartisanship that was largely the function of the fact that the parties were
We're less
not
differentiated.
actually well sorted
That's right.
on ideology or on
Yeah.
attitudes towards ethnicity after
Yeah.
1965, when the Republicans,
Yeah.
when after Johnson signs the Civil Rights
Yeah.
Act and Southern Democrats start to realign with the GOP, the
Yeah.
parties start to sort more
Yeah.
on race and kind of conservative ideology.
Yep.
And so you would expect that to diminish
Yep.
trust in other party, like
Yes.
that's a fun,
That's right.
that's a mechanism of polarization,
Yep.
and
And you see it.
polarization reduces trust in government whenever the other party is in power.
That's right. And it's just what you see. I mean, I think something like 8 to 10% of Republicans under Obama thought that the government could generally be trusted to do the right thing. I mean, just phenomenally low. One reason it's sort of sad. I'm not expecting Trump to just destroy the political trust numbers among Democrats, because they're already very low for George W. Bush. And Republican numbers were already high. So I don't know if, we're already pretty close to the limit. But I don't want to ever say things couldn't get worse, because of course they always can. And of course,
They're
if there's
just getting worse.
well, yeah. I mean, you might think, just to not to stick up for Trump, but to rip on W a bit.
Right.
We haven't had this sort of like disastrous intervention of the Iraq War.
Right.
The nice thing about Trump is just how pathetically inept he is. So much so that his closest advisors will just ignore him when he asks them to do something crazy in some cases, right? Which is what we
Right.
just being revealed to us, that people were just like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. Dick Cheney and W, people are going to do what they tell them to do more often. So at the very least, maybe Trump won't be as damaging to trust as you might think, just because of how ineffectual he is. And I think, Chris Hayes wrote a book on this some years ago about, a lot of people talked about like the failure of the elite classes during the 2000s.
Twilight of the elites.
Yeah. And you might think, that's really, trust destructive, particularly for trust in government. And you might think, Trump's not going to make that better. But in many ways, is a consequence of that attitude. But of course, I think a lot of other factors played in. There's a lot of randomness going on, a lot of other things that make it harder to draw any.
Well, it does seem clear that one of the, so I'm more pessimistic about Trump's effect on political trust.
I'm pessimistic. I'm just, there might be a limit to how bad it can get.
Yeah.
Given
what I really worry about, especially given the extremely strong results on the effects of perceived corruption on political trust.
That's right.
I think Trump's corruption has like no limit, and I mean, just the guy is using his power to line his pockets constantly. There's just like no, there's like.
That's
basically
right.
no non-corrupt thing he does.
No, that's right. So here's the interesting thing is, you can line up many acts of petty corruption, like just tons of it. And then you can look at like one big act of grand corruption, right? So the big act of grand corruption for Bush is the sense that he lied, and I think the truth is that he lied to the public about the war in this one big salient way. So both of them can hurt trust a lot. So I don't want to say Trump's not going to have a negative effect. I just wanted to highlight that, say, a grand act of corruption like, with Nixon or with W can also be very, very destructive. So all I'm suggesting is just that there's different ways in which corruption can occur and different ways that it can go wrong. And yeah, I think the other issue, though, and this is important too, is that sometimes political trust is measured as trust in particular of figures, and other times it's measured about trust in government or democracy. And the worry is that if you have enough particular politicians that are constantly corrupt, that's going to taint people's trust in democracy generally. So the worry is that if you have enough corrupt officials, then people trust democracy less, and then that's really bad. So, what you want, I think, ideally, is you want a sort of high level of trust in democracy, but you want some skepticism in the particular people that are in power. But if the people in power are so bad and they're just such grifters, and particularly for long periods of time, that may start to poison broader forms of political trust in broader institutions, because people think, look, democracy just produces these corrupt people. So
Yeah, if you think you can't ever get a non-poisonous
that's right.
leader, like
That's right.
then you're like, I think people do have some expectation that power changes hands
Yeah.
between parties and factions, that you're gonna like the party you don't vote for less.
Yeah.
Um, and that, so you're going to see some fluctuation around
That's
who's
right.
in power.
That's right.
But if there's a general sense that, like, no matter who's in power, it's a
Yeah.
corrupt schmuck
Yeah.
who's just going to rip us off, like,
Yeah.
then the belief in the legitimacy of the entire system starts
Yeah.
to collapse,
Yeah.
and that gets
That's the word.
dangerous.
That's the word. And we don't know, and there's some disputes about even the basic facts about what political trust is doing in outside the US, like in Western Europe.
Mm-hmm.
People were thinking it was falling for a while. So they were looking at sort of like cross-national trends to try to explain things. Things like, for instance, people becoming wealthier, and so they become more confident and more sort of educated, and they become, post-materialists,
Mm-hmm.
right? So they become more trusting in democracy. They like democracy for moral reasons, but they're more discerning and skeptical, And then the thought was, okay, well, we can have that explanation explain the falling political trust in particular governments, but confidence in democracy remains high, so falling political trust isn't a huge deal. But now there's this new data suggesting that it isn't even falling very much in Europe. It does look like it's taken a really big hit in the U.S. There's a lot of questions about where the data is as far as trust levels across, well, particularly in Western Europe. And some people were wanting to say, well, maybe there's falling trust. Look at all the populism. So there's some disputes there. But in most of the democratic world, people's sort of trust in democracy remains high. The bigger issues for trust in democracy are in the new democracies, where people were kind of told it was going to be awesome, and then it wasn't as awesome, and so
Yeah.
they're less trusting in it because they're disappointed.
Well, we've talked a while now. Let's
Yeah.
What are
Yeah.
some of your? This is just scratching the surface of Kevin's amazing paper. Um, at the end of the paper, your seventh part, you've got implications for sustaining
Yeah.
a diverse social order.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us something about, like, what you think
Yeah.
you learned from the trust literature that's a little bit different than maybe
Yeah.
people have heard before?
So I hope you won't mind if I advertise my new
No,
book
please.
a little bit. This is Must Politics Be War? Restoring Our Trust in the Open Society. In the book, what I try to do is I'm trying to solve a broader problem about whether politics as such is war.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I try to do is to say, well, we need to look for the institutions that can sustain trust, because when you have higher trust, you can end conflict more easily.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the reasons I got into the trust literature is I was trying to see, well, which institutions actually have these effects. And what I came away with is actually that the institutions of an open society, particularly things like freedom of association, well-protected property rights, economic security, oftentimes secured through social insurance, that the rule of law, and functional sort of democratic government are all either trust sustaining or trust increasing.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the messages of the book, and